Hello and welcome, dear listeners. If you love cozy, classic-style mysteries with a clever twist, you're in the right place. Be sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a story. We release 2 audiobooks every week right here on this channel. And remember, the Inspector Price mysteries are only available here, so sit back, relax, and enjoy today's audiobook, The Vanishing of Lady Penrose. Chapter 1. The Empty Cabin. The early spring of 1926 brought with it an unsettled wind that gusted in from the English Channel, tugging at overcoats and veils with equal indifference. In the port town of Dover, the air was thick with salt and the heavy scent of diesel as the SS Calais Belle, a stately cross-channel ferry, docked with a mournful groan. Among the usual bustle of porters and dockhands, a black motor car stood discreetly beside the customs shed, its polished surface glinting in the morning sun. Inside sat a man of composed bearing and quiet distinction. His overcoat was buttoned neatly, a dark trilby shadowing a broad brow, and intelligent, steel-grey eyes that observed the key with clinical precision. He lit a cigarette with one smooth motion, then exhaled slowly. Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard was not fond of distractions. Yet when the telegram arrived the evening prior, he had been intrigued. Lady Penrose missing. Calais to Dover ferry. Cabin locked from inside. Urgent. Dover Constabulary. Lady Vivian Penrose. A name that evoked champagne receptions in Mayfair, pearls at Ascot, and whispers in the drawing-rooms of London society. Glamorous, elusive, and married to Lord Reginald Penrose, a man whose influence reached Parliament and beyond. The sudden disappearance of such a woman, in the confined space of a cross-channel ferry, was bound to raise questions. And Inspector Price, known for his impeccable discretion and an uncanny nose for illusion, had been quietly summoned by the Home Office. As passengers began disembarking in a gentle tide of laughter and luggage, Price stepped out. He was met by Chief Inspector Godfrey Lane, a tall, sunburned man with thinning hair and a sense of constant agitation. "Inspector Price, thank heavens you came down." "Never seen anything like it. The lady's gone, vanished from a locked cabin." He shook Price's hand hastily. "Foul play, most likely. But how and by whom, I've no earthly clue." Price arched an eyebrow. "Let's start with the facts. The cabin?" Lane gestured toward the gangway. "This way. First class, starboard side. Steward discovered her absence when he knocked to help her disembark. Door locked from the inside. Had to break in." They made their way up the gangplank and into the narrow wood-panelled corridors of the ship. The SS Calais Belle was no longer in her youth. Gilt-trimmed banisters and oil lamps lent the interior an air of nostalgic grandeur. Passengers had long since departed, and the cabin in question, cabin 3B, stood alone at the end of a curtained hallway. A uniformed steward waited outside, looking pale. "She checked in at Calais, sir," he offered nervously. "Had her own key. Luggage was placed inside by a porter. I brought her tea at 8. She asked not to be disturbed till arrival. That was the last I saw of her." Price entered the cabin. It was small but well appointed. A single plush armchair, a writing desk, a porthole half covered by cream curtains. On the narrow berth, an elegant travelling coat lay folded, and beside it, a silk scarf with the initials VP embroidered in gold thread. No sign of struggle, no overturned chairs. And yet, the door had only one lock, an old brass bolt on the inside. No other way in or out. The porthole was far too narrow for anyone to pass through, and yet Lady Penrose had not disembarked. Her passport, hatbox, and 2 trunks were still present in the adjoining baggage area. "I presume you've had the ship searched?" Price asked. "From bow to stern," Lane replied grimly. "Nothing, and no witnesses saw her leave." Price moved to the writing desk and examined it with care. A faint scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air. He opened the drawer. Inside lay a single page, torn from a French newspaper. An advertisement circled in red pencil. "Gala Masquerade, Villa Madame, Marseille, exclusive society reception, April 10th. Curious, Price folded it and slipped it into his pocket. "Has Lord Penrose been notified?" He asked at last. Lane gave a small cough. "Yes, he's arriving this afternoon. Took it rather calmly, truth be told. Said she'd done this before." "Run off?" "Disappeared for days. Paris once, Venice another time. Always turned up with some silly story," he said. Price looked out the porthole, the grey sea glinting under streaks of morning light. His expression did not change. "Even so," he said quietly, "this time I suspect she won't turn up with quite the same story." Chapter 2. A Husband Too Calm. Lord Reginald Penrose arrived at the Dover station that same afternoon with all the hauteur of a man accustomed to invitations, not investigations. A former Foreign Office attaché, now a sitting peer in the House of Lords, Lord Penrose was a tall, silver-haired gentleman with an angular face, clipped moustache, and a demeanour that suggested both military efficiency and emotional detachment. He descended from the first-class carriage without haste, followed by a valet and a porter, bearing a modest leather suitcase. His dark overcoat was perfectly tailored, his gloves immaculate, and his expression unreadable. Inspector Price stood waiting by the platform gates, flanked by Chief Inspector Lane, whose nerves had not improved since morning. "Lord Penrose," Lane stepped forward quickly. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Let us dispense with niceties," Penrose said coldly. "You have summoned me regarding my wife's apparent disappearance, and I am here to assist in any way I can. Though if I may say so, I find the fuss rather excessive. Vivienne has a habit of vanishing when it suits her." Price regarded the man in silence, then stepped forward. "Inspector Harold Price, Scotland Yard. I've been asked to oversee the matter." Penrose gave a curt nod. "Ah, I was told the Yard had taken an interest. I suppose it's not every day a peer's wife performs a disappearing act in the middle of the English Channel." "If you don't mind," Price said, "I'd prefer to hear the last time you saw Lady Penrose, in your own words." Penrose exhaled through his nose and glanced at his pocket watch. 3 days ago, at our townhouse in Belgravia. She was due to attend a fashion event in Paris, hosted by the House of Worth. I escorted her to Victoria Station. We had luncheon, potted shrimp, if you must know, and she boarded the train in good spirits. "Was there any quarrel between you?" A faint smile flickered across Penrose's lips. "Vivienne and I quarrel constantly, but not in any way that would suggest she intended to disappear. She finds such antics exhilarating. Paris, Venice, Cairo, always a letter after a few days with vague apologies and some charming nonsense. I assumed this would be no different." "And yet," Price said softly, "this time there is no letter, no telegram, and she vanished from a locked cabin without a trace." Lord Penrose's brow twitched. "I concede it is strange," he admitted, "but it would not be the first time she orchestrated something elaborate. She has an affection for theatrics. Too much imagination and not enough sense." "Did she have any enemies?" Price asked, watching the man closely. Penrose's response was instantaneous and dry. "Only women she outshone, and men she refused." "And you, my lord?" Penrose met Price's gaze with a subtle, steely glint. "Inspector, I am a busy man with no patience for melodrama. My wife and I have lived largely separate lives, if that's what you're implying. I tolerated her whims. She tolerated my disinterest. It was a mutually agreeable arrangement." Chief Inspector Lane shifted uncomfortably. Price's face remained unreadable. "She travelled alone to Paris," Price continued. "She always insisted on it. Vivienne loathed chaperones. She claimed it made her feel like a duchess in chains." "And in Paris? Did she mention whom she was visiting?" Lord Penrose tapped a gloved finger against his lip. "She did say she might see an old friend, a man named Armand Lefebvre, some painter, I believe. They met years ago during one of her Riviera escapades." "Would you say she was romantically involved with him?" "I wouldn't say anything of the sort," Penrose said with a thin smile. "But if she was, I would not have objected. As I said, separate lives. Inspector Price made a mental note. Armand Lefebvre, a name worth chasing. Do you recognise this? Price pulled from his coat pocket the newspaper clipping, the advertisement for the masked gala in Marseille. Penrose glanced at it, then gave a short laugh. That is precisely her style. Costumes, secrets, drama. But no, I've never seen this, though it would explain her unseasonably large trunk. Large trunk? Price echoed. Yes, had the valet carry it to the station, far too large for a 3-day jaunt to Paris. But then, Vivian never packed for the occasion, only for the effect. They left the station and returned to the constabulary's temporary office near the harbour, where Lady Penrose's luggage had been carefully inventoried. 2 trunks, a leather hat box, a travelling case. The trunks bore a distinct gold monogram, VP, and the crest of the Penrose family on the side. Price had them opened in Penrose's presence. The first contained her wardrobe, elegant gowns of satin and lace, Parisian shoes, a silver vanity case. Nothing appeared disturbed. The second was more curious. Masks, feathers, opera gloves, and a bottle of absinthe wrapped in silk. Beneath a false bottom, Inspector Price found a small pouch of French francs, a pair of binoculars, and a passport in the name of Madame Elise Durand, bearing Lady Penrose's photograph. Penrose raised an eyebrow. So she intended to travel incognito. That, at least, is new. Lane gasped. An alias? Price said nothing at first. He studied the passport, then the mask, a fine Venetian piece, painted in black and silver. His fingers lingered over it. The question is, he murmured, why would a society woman vanish in the guise of someone else, and go to such lengths to do so on a locked ferry? He turned to Penrose. My lord, I have no doubt your wife has a flair for the dramatic, but it seems she was planning more than just a holiday in Paris, and I intend to find out what. Lord Penrose adjusted his gloves and stood. Do as you must, Inspector. I only ask for discretion. I cannot afford scandal. Price met his gaze. And I cannot afford a murder. For the first time Penrose paled. Chapter 3. A Passport to Paris. 3 days later, Inspector Harold Price stepped off the early morning express at Gare du Nord, his leather satchel in hand, and the brim of his hat shielding him from the low Parisian sun. The city was awakening with a sleepy post-war glamour, the cafes still sleepy-eyed, the newsboys shouting headlines, and the scent of warm bread trailing from the boulangeries like a promise. Price had not been to Paris in 5 years, not since a diplomatic case involving a stolen cipher and a Russian defector, and he had not missed the French bureaucracy. But this time, his path was blessedly cleared by a discreet telegram from Whitehall to the British Consulate General, requesting cooperation in the investigation of a missing aristocrat. Still, the matter was delicate. An English lady of noble lineage had vanished, quite possibly under a false name, carrying forged documents and last seen boarding a ferry after a brief Parisian escapade. Price was acutely aware that whatever he uncovered, diplomacy must dance hand in hand with truth. At the Hôtel de Montclair in the 7th arrondissement, Price found a modest but elegant room reserved under the name Madame Elise Durand. A quick check with the concierge confirmed that the woman matching Lady Penrose's description had stayed there, briefly, just 2 nights prior. Oui, monsieur, said the concierge, a round-shouldered man, with thin spectacles. She arrived Thursday evening, very stylish, Parisian French, but not quite native, if you understand. She gave no forwarding address, only said she was en route to the south. Did she meet with anyone? Price asked. The man hesitated. She had breakfast with a gentleman, a painter, I believe. Monsieur Lefebvre, tall, grey around the temples, a bit of the bohemian in him. Armand Lefebvre, the name Vivienne's husband had mentioned. A Parisian painter with a storied past. According to preliminary records Price had accessed in Dover, Lefebvre had exhibited in the early 1910s and vanished from the scene during the war years. Rumours swirled about his associations, with avant-garde circles, women of means, and even anarchists. Price made his way to Rue des Martyrs, where a crooked brass plaque marked Atelier Armand Lefebvre, artiste peintre. The building was narrow and four-storied, with ivy crawling up its side. Price climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, where the scent of turpentine and stale tobacco greeted him. He knocked. A voice dry and impatient answered in French. Oui, entrez. Price pushed open the door and found himself in a high-ceilinged studio. The walls were lined with unfinished canvases, each one more abstract than the last, splashes of crimson and cobalt that hinted at human forms, but revealed little. A phonograph crackled softly in the background, playing a scratchy waltz. Armand Lefebvre stood in the light of a north-facing window, brush in hand, squinting at a canvas. He wore a worn velvet jacket, paint-smeared trousers, and a blue silk scarf knotted at the throat. His eyes, grey, keen and slightly bloodshot, darted to Price. "You are not the girl with the tea," he said, "which means you must be a policeman." Price smiled thinly. "Worse, I'm from Scotland Yard." Lefebvre exhaled through his nose and dropped the brush into a jar of cloudy water. "Vivian finally succeeded in scandal, then?" Price took a few steps inside. "You knew her as Elise Durand, I presume." The painter let out a short, humourless laugh. "She always was theatrical. Vivian, Elise, Lady So-and-so. A name was just a costume to her." "When did you last see her?" Lefebvre walked to a sideboard and poured himself a glass of absinthe without offering any to Price. 3 nights ago. She came here late, wore a black veil and perfume that smelled like autumn, sat exactly where you're standing now, told me she was going south, Marseille, perhaps further. Why? She didn't say, but she carried herself like a woman with purpose. Not one running away, but one running towards something. Price studied him carefully. "How long had you known her?" Lefebvre swirled the green liquid in his glass. "Since 1912. She was posing for an artist in Montmartre. I was young, ambitious, a little drunk on the idea of revolution and art. She was married to her first husband then, a baron, I think, or a banker. She had already begun collecting secrets." "Secrets?" Lefebvre shrugged. "She knew people, names, affairs, things one whispers in the dark, never in daylight. It made her dangerous, but thrilling." Price leaned forward. Was she in danger now? For the first time the painter hesitated. He looked toward the window, where sunlight slanted across the floor. "She seemed afraid," he said quietly. "Not of a person, of being watched. She said she'd seen someone on the train, a man she thought was following her. But when she tried to describe him, her words failed." Price narrowed his eyes. "Do you know where in Marseille she was going?" "She mentioned a villa, something called Madame's house. I assumed it was some decadent party place. You know these people. Rich, bored, drowning in absinthe and masks." Price stiffened. He reached into his coat and produced the torn advertisement. "Villa Madame, Masque Gala, April 10th. Lefebvre nodded slowly. "That's it. She told me she had to be there, as if it were a rendezvous, a final act." There was a silence between them, broken only by the soft scratch of the phonograph needle. "Do you believe she's dead?" Lefebvre asked suddenly. Price studied the painter's expression, the subtle tightness around the eyes, the hand that clutched the glass too firmly. "I believe," Price said at last, "that someone wanted her to disappear. The question is whether she vanished by design or by force." He turned to leave, then paused. "One last thing, Monsieur Lefebvre. Do you know anyone who would benefit from her disappearance?" Lefebvre looked at the nearest canvas, an unfinished portrait of a woman in profile. "Everyone loved Vivian," he said, "but no one ever really knew her." As Inspector Price stepped back into the chill Paris air, the weight of mystery pressed upon him. Lady Penrose had walked these streets only days before, masked, secretive, afraid. Now, with only whispers and disguises as clues, he would follow her trail southward. To Marseille, to Villa Madame, and perhaps to the truth. Chapter 4. The Actress and the Artist. Marseille, with its chaotic beauty, unfolded like an ancient theatre under the southern sun. Whitewashed buildings clung to the hillsides, fishermen shouted in the vieux port, and the scent of sea brine mingled with bouillabaisse and petrol. It was a city that wore many masks, cosmopolitan and corrupt, romantic and ruthless. Perfect, Inspector Price thought, for a woman skilled in disguise. The train from Paris arrived just before midday, the air already heavy with warmth and the cries of hawkers peddling fresh oranges and cigarettes. Price, ever deliberate, made his way through the winding streets of the old quarter to a modest pension recommended by the consulate. His room overlooked a busy market square and smelled faintly of lemon and old books. He wasted no time. The address on the masquerade gala advertisement, found in Lady Penrose's cabin, led to the outskirts of the city, to a secluded neighbourhood known as Montredon, perched between the hills and the sea. There, shrouded by tall cypresses and high wrought-iron gates, stood an elegant but strangely austere villa marked only by a brass plate. Villa Madame. No house number, no name beneath, just that. A gatekeeper in livery emerged as Price rang the bell, his expression somewhere between cautious and theatrical. "I'm afraid there is no one at home, monsieur," the man said in French. "The villa is privately leased for special engagements. No visitors." Price presented his credentials with quiet authority, watching the man's reaction carefully. "Scotland Yard," the gatekeeper repeated, brows lifting. "How very dramatic." Before Price could ask any further questions, the gate swung shut with a theatrical clang. Undeterred, Price walked the perimeter of the property, noting that the villa's gardens sloped gently toward the cliffside. Ivy-clad terraces, wide balconies, and marble balustrades gave the house a decadent Mediterranean air. There were no signs of life, no servants, no laughter, no music drifting from open windows. The only evidence of recent activity was the fresh indentation of carriage wheels in the gravel and cigarette butts scattered near the garden side entrance, fine Egyptian imports trimmed in gold. Back in town, Price made for the Hôtel du Soleil, a favoured haunt of international artists and visiting aristocrats, the sort of place that existed in every port city, theatrical, scandalous, and untraceable. The concierge there, a gossipy man with scented hair pomade, responded eagerly when Price inquired about Lady Penrose. "Ah, but of course, the beautiful Englishwoman, blonde, tall, dressed in that flowing ivory ensemble. She dined here with an actress from the Théâtre Antoine, a Mademoiselle Sibylle Renard. You will want to speak with her, no doubt." Price found Mademoiselle Renard on the hotel's shaded terrace, sipping coffee and thumbing through a script with long lacquered nails. She wore dark round sunglasses, a turban, and the detached look of someone well practised at pretending to care. When Price introduced himself, her painted lips twitched upward. "Scotland Yard," she said, with evident delight. "My dear monsieur, I do hope this is about a missing jewel or a stolen manuscript, something deliciously English." "Not quite," Price said. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Lady Vivian Penrose." The sunglasses came off. Sibylle's eyes, hazel, intelligent and sharp, narrowed. "Vivian's gone? How very Vivian! You knew her well?" "I knew her well enough to know no one ever truly knew her," Sibylle replied. "She was elusive, but magnetic. Men fell over themselves. Women watched from across the room, pretending not to envy her." "She dined with you here recently?" "Yes, 2 nights before the masked gala at Villa Madame. We drank absinthe and smoked those dreadful thin cigarettes she liked. She was nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder. I asked her if she feared someone. She said," Sibylle paused, eyes distant, "I fear being seen before I'm ready to be seen." Price tilted his head. What did she mean by that? She never explained, but I assumed it had to do with the gala. She had plans, that much was clear. She asked me if I believed in reinvention. "And you said?" "I said I was an actress, of course I did." Price sipped his coffee slowly. What do you know of Villa Madame? Sibylle gave a short laugh. It's infamous, monsieur. By day, it's a rented villa. By night, it becomes a stage. Costumes, secrecy, deals behind masks, a place where names don't matter, only intentions. Did you attend the gala? I did not. I was performing in Hedda Gabler that night. She toyed with her earring. Vivian, though, she was obsessed with the villa. Said she would find something there. Or someone. Someone. She didn't name them, but she asked me a strange thing. She asked what I would do if I knew a person's identity was a lie. If I discovered that a count was no count at all, but perhaps a man hiding something darker. Price leaned forward. Did she say who this man was? No, but she was carrying something that night. A thin, wrapped parcel, like documents or art. She kept it tucked beneath her coat. Said it was leverage. And then she kissed me on both cheeks, laughed, and vanished into a motor car headed up the coast. That was the last you saw of her? Sibylle nodded. But the next morning I received a note. No name, just this. She reached into her handbag and produced a small envelope, cream-coloured, bearing a crimson wax seal. Inside was a card with a single line, in a slanting, delicate hand. Truth must wear a mask before it shows its face. Price stared at it, turning it over. No signature, no insignia. What do you think it means? Sibylle asked. Price's mind was already turning. It means that whatever Lady Penrose hoped to find at Villa Madame, she believed it would expose someone, perhaps someone powerful or dangerous. He stood folding the card into his coat. One last thing, he said. Do you know if she left Marseille? Sibylle Renard adjusted her turban and smiled without humour. Oh, Inspector, women like Vivian don't leave cities. Cities absorb them. That evening, back in his small pension room, Price reviewed his notes under the yellow glow of the desk lamp. Lady Penrose had adopted a false identity. She travelled with a forged passport. She visited a secretive villa on the edge of Marseille. She feared someone, or something, would expose her before she could expose them. And now she was gone. Perhaps murdered. Or perhaps still hiding behind the one thing she had always mastered, a mask. Chapter 5. The Man on the Ferry. The following morning Inspector Price awoke early, shaved carefully, and dressed in a light tweed suit, neutral, nondescript, but crisply tailored. Today he would go where he had not yet been welcomed. He was going inside Villa Madame. But before that, he paid a quiet visit to the Port Authority, a dull ochre building near the docks, with salt-rusted shutters and the scent of seaweed lingering in its stairwells. There, tucked behind a cluttered desk, a balding officer with a monocle, Captain Rousseau, flipped through passenger manifests. Yes, yes, monsieur, he murmured in clipped French. The ferry crossing on April 11th, Calais to Dover. You're looking for Lady Penrose, yes? The Englishwoman with the alias? Price nodded. I believe she boarded under the name Elise Durand. Ah, voilà, Rousseau tapped the paper. Cabin 3B. But you may be interested in this. He drew out a second sheet and turned it around. Cabin 3C across the hall, reserved under the name Georges Marchand. No record of him returning to France. No luggage claimed, no forwarding address. Price leaned forward. Do you have a photograph? Of course not, but... The officer rummaged through a canvas pouch and produced a sketch, hastily drawn in pencil, likely by a steward. It showed a man with a sharp chin, small eyes, and a crooked nose, nondescript but vaguely unsettling. Several crew members noted him pacing outside cabin 3B around midnight. He claimed to be stretching his legs, but after the ship docked, no one saw him again. Nothing in the cabin? A few cigarette ends English brand, a matchbook from a Parisian club, and this. He handed over a small item in a waxed envelope, a fragment of a torn telegram, barely legible. Delivered in person, Villa Madame, before masked gala. Price stared at it. Someone else had travelled aboard that ferry with intent. Someone who had an interest in what was to be delivered at Villa Madame. Someone who disappeared the same night as Lady Penrose. He pocketed the sketch and stood. "Merci, Captain. You've been very helpful." "Will you find her, monsieur?" Price gave a slight, grim smile. "One way or another." By early afternoon, clouds had gathered over the cliffs. Inspector Price returned to Montredon, once again at the black iron gates of Villa Madame. This time, he wore a charcoal cloak and dark gloves, the envelope with the crimson seal tucked visibly in his breast pocket. He rang once and waited. The same gatekeeper opened, his expression unreadable. "You again, monsieur?" Price tapped the sealed envelope. "I bring a reply from one of your recent guests. I believe Madame will want to read it herself." A pause, then a nod. The gate creaked open, reluctantly. He was ushered down a gravel path bordered by towering oleanders. The villa loomed ahead, pale stone and shuttered windows, grand but discreet. The scent of lavender and something musky lingered in the air. Somewhere, a wind chime stirred. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly silent. Velvet drapes dimmed the afternoon light. Chandeliers hung like skeletal remnants above antique furniture. No servants moved, no voices echoed. Only the occasional ticking of a distant clock disturbed the hush. He was led into a parlour where a woman in black sat by a marble fireplace, arranging tarot cards with gloved hands. She looked up. She was in her early 60s, regal in posture, with silver hair wound high like a Greco-Roman statue. Her eyes were dark and penetrating, eyes that had seen many secrets and kept more. "I am Madame Vassel," she said, voice smooth and measured. "And you are not a messenger." "No," Price said. "I am Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard." He stepped forward, removing his gloves. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Lady Penrose." A flicker of amusement crossed her face. "So she has succeeded, then?" "In vanishing?" "No, in mattering." Price said nothing. He allowed the silence to press in. Madame Vassel gestured to a velvet chair. "Sit, Inspector. But I warn you, truth in this house is a fleeting guest." He remained standing. "I understand Lady Penrose attended your masquerade gala." She did, as did 37 others, royals, exiles, heirs, lovers, all masked, all anonymous, such is the appeal. What was her mask? Silver, half-faced, wore it with an ivory gown. She danced twice, then walked into the library and never returned. Price's voice was still. "She disappeared here?" Madame nodded once. "We searched the house. No body, no trace. Her coat remained on the banister, her mask on the escritoire, but she was gone." "No one saw her leave?" "None, and yet we are on a cliff, Inspector. The sea gives no testimony." Price stepped toward her. "Did she speak to anyone that night? Did she carry anything?" "A thin folder, tied in blue ribbon. She clutched it like a Bible. I assumed it was a love letter or a will." "And the guests?" "All sworn to anonymity. That is our code." "Even if one of them is a murderer?" Madame Vassel smiled without mirth. "Here, Inspector, names are shadows, but let me offer you one more." She reached into her cloak and produced a small photograph. It showed Lady Penrose laughing beside a man in a white linen suit. The same man in the sketch Price had obtained earlier. "Do you know him?" Price asked. "Only that he called himself Marius, but he spoke perfect English, the kind spoken in Westminster." "Did he and Lady Penrose know each other?" "They did not arrive together, but by midnight they were speaking alone, in hushed tones. I saw them disappear into the conservatory. And then she was gone, and so was he." Price turned the photo over. In faded ink it was dated Casablanca, 1919. "Do you have records of that night?" Madame's voice turned cold. "There are no records, only masks." That evening, Price returned to his lodging with the photo and his thoughts. Lady Penrose had brought something to the masquerade. Documents, perhaps. Evidence. She had come to confront a man from her past. Someone once trusted. Someone dangerous. Now, both were missing, and only the sea remained between the known and the unknown. Price knew that the mask was beginning to slip, but what lay beneath it might change everything. Chapter 6. The Woman in the Sea. The morning air was laced with brine as Inspector Price walked along the narrow trail that twisted down from the cliffs of Montredon to the jagged shoreline below. He had received a note, anonymous, unsigned, but unmistakably intentional. Slipped beneath his door in the early hours, it had been scrawled in fine, angular script. Go to the Côte de la Lune. Low tide reveals more than footprints. The Côte de la Lune, or Moon Coast, was a secluded stretch of coastline, just a mile south of Ville-Madame, where black volcanic rock formed natural inlets and sea caves, often hidden when the tide was high. Smugglers had once used the coast, Price recalled, and whispers still lingered of secret meetings and hidden things, mostly myth, mostly forgotten. But someone wanted him there, and that made it real enough. He reached the bottom of the trail as gulls circled above. The tide was out, and the sand was damp with the sheen of retreating water. The air held that curious stillness, unique to places just outside the reach of ordinary life. And then he saw it. Half concealed by a tumble of kelp and black rock, a pale hand, limp and waxen, protruded from a narrow tidal pool. Price dropped to one knee and cleared the seaweed. It was the body of a woman, wedged beneath a crevice, her ivory gown soaked and tangled, her shoes missing, her face was obscured by silt and shell. A torn fragment of silver mask still clung to her hairline. The skin was bloated from exposure, but bore no wounds. He drew in a slow breath. It had to be Lady Penrose. By mid-afternoon, the woman's body lay under a white cloth on a table at the Marseille municipal mortuary, where the coroner, Dr. Émile Fournier, conducted his examination with clinical detachment. No sign of strangulation, Fournier muttered. No blunt force trauma. No wounds, visible or internal. Poison? Price asked, arms crossed tightly. Perhaps. She had traces of opium alkaloids in her bloodstream, enough to render her unconscious, but not enough to kill her unless she drowned. Fournier nodded grimly. She was alive when she entered the water, but only just. And time of death? 48 hours ago, roughly. Give or take the tide. Price exhaled. The night of the masquerade. Was she suicidal? No, Price said immediately. She was frightened, yes, but she came here for a reason. She brought evidence. She was preparing to expose someone. I believe she was silenced. Dr. Fournier handed him a small plastic pouch containing items retrieved from the folds of her gown. This was found sewn into the lining of her dress, hidden well. Inside was a silver locket, dull with sea salt. Price opened it. Inside were two photographs. On one side, Lady Penrose as a young bride, radiant and smiling. On the other, the same mysterious man from the Ferry, Georges Marchand, or Marius, as he was known, at Ville-Madame. Beneath the locket's clasp, hidden in a false compartment, was a tightly folded scrap of dampened paper. Price unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile parchment. It was a coded note, the ink blurred but partially legible. Notify the Foreign Office, Marius identity false, tied to 1919 affair in Casablanca, evidence in possession, Villa Madame Rendezvous. He closed the locket gently, mind racing. So Marius, the man on the ferry, had been the focus of her investigation. She had known him, feared him, traced him here to Marseille. And the reference to the Foreign Office that pulled the curtain further aside. Was Lady Penrose involved in something beyond social scandal? Was this a matter of state secrets? Back in town, Price returned to the British consulate, where the consular clerk, a bespectacled man named Mr. Elwell, greeted him with restrained curiosity. I understand you've discovered something, Elwell said. Price handed him the coded note and watched his face blanch. Good heavens, this... Elwell looked up, adjusting his spectacles. Casablanca, 1919. That was the operation we buried so deep, no one even whispers it anymore. What was it? A failed intelligence sting. The post-war treaties were still being drafted. An operative under the name Marius infiltrated a French diplomatic circle under British pretenses. It ended badly. 2 agents dead, documents missing. The man vanished, and no one identified him. He was a ghost, a skilled one. The Home Office issued quiet notices, but buried it soon after. Only a handful of names remained on the suspect list. Price's gaze sharpened. Do you have those names? Elwell hesitated. Unofficially? Nothing about this case has been official since the moment Lady Penrose stepped onto the ferry. Elwell opened a locked drawer, pulled out a yellowing folder, and spread the contents on the desk. Photographs, reports, fragments of intelligence dispatches. And then, there he was, the same man, Marius Georges Marchand, or whoever he truly was. Real name unknown, Elwell muttered. Believed to be of mixed Anglo-French background. Disappeared after Casablanca. Has resurfaced occasionally under aliases. Rumoured to sell information. Blackmail, seduction. Very dangerous. Price tapped the photograph. This man was with Lady Penrose the night she died. Elwell paled. Then she knew something, or had something, and he couldn't let her live. Price nodded slowly. I believe she had documents that proved his identity. That's what she brought to the villa. They're missing. And if he has them, he'll vanish again, unless he hadn't yet left, unless he was still here, under another mask, waiting until the storm passed. Price stood abruptly. I'll need a list of all attendees at Villa Madame's gala, even masked ones. Cross-reference any aliases known to the Foreign Office. Someone there knows him. Someone there saw them together. And if he fled, Price's voice was cold, then I'll follow him, to London, to Casablanca, to hell if need be. That evening, in his modest room overlooking the square, Inspector Price sat with the photograph of Lady Penrose in his hands. Her face, though touched by the sea, still bore the elegance of a woman who knew too much, and had dared to unmask the truth. He looked out the window. The sun had set, and with it, the city of Marseille had transformed once more into a stage of shadows and whispers. The sea had surrendered her body, but the secrets remained, and Price would not leave until he had exhumed every last one. Chapter 7. A Lady Reborn. 3 nights after the body of Lady Penrose was pulled from the sea, the lights of Villa Madame once again flickered to life. A second masquerade gala was being held. Officially, it was a charity event, hosted by Madame Vassal in honour of a visiting Austrian pianist. Unofficially, the invitations had gone out quietly to the same guests who had attended the gala the night of Lady Penrose's disappearance. By design, Inspector Harold Price, dressed in a charcoal mask and formal black evening wear, stood on the edges of the villa's terrace, blending into the murmur of music and perfume and feathered strangers. His gloved hand rested on a folded document tucked into his coat, a replica of the paper Lady Penrose had carried, its contents painstakingly reconstructed by British intelligence. A list of aliases and code names, correspondence that proved Marius, the vanished man from the ferry, and the villa, was not only real, but had operated under multiple false identities during and after the Great War. And now he was here again. Price had studied every guest, every gesture. He had narrowed it to 3 suspects, each one elegant, each one polite, each with a history tied to the shadows of espionage. But only one had spoken to Lady Penrose that night. Only one had reason to kill her. And only one had vanished without a trace up until now. Bonsoir, a voice said softly beside him. Price turned. The man standing there wore a white mask and a pale linen suit. Smooth, confident, dangerous. I believe we met once before, Price said evenly, though you wore a different face. Many faces, the man replied. As have we all, Inspector. Haven't you learned by now? Truth is not found in the mask, but in the man who wears it best. Marius? The man did not answer, but his smile deepened. They stood in silence for a moment. Behind them, a waltz swelled through the villa, and guests spun past in a blur of silk and champagne. You killed her, Price said, his voice low. Lady Penrose trusted you once, in Casablanca perhaps, but she discovered your betrayal. She brought proof, and she died for it. She died, the man said calmly, because she believed she could win. She underestimated how far I would go. She drowned, Price said, eyes narrowing, because you drugged her and dragged her down to the sea. You knew about the caves. Perhaps you used them before. You assumed the tide would take her. Marius gave a small shrug. And yet, here we are. Price took a step forward. The British government knows who you are. We have your file, your operations, the names you sold, the men who died. And what will they do? Marius replied, smiling. Arrest a ghost? Who will testify? A corpse? I will, said a voice behind them. The masked man turned sharply. Standing by the arched window, tall, poised, alive, was Lady Penrose. Gasps rippled around the terrace as a few guests turned to look. She wore a deep sapphire gown and no mask, her golden hair pinned with pearls, her face pale but radiant. Alive. Very much alive. Marius's smile collapsed. You, he whispered, you drowned. No, Vivienne Penrose said, stepping forward. You left me to drown. But the sea was kinder than you. It washed me into the southern cove, where a fisherman found me half alive. I told him I was no one, just another face in a city full of masks. She looked at Price. I sent you the note about the moon coast. I wanted to see if I could trust you. Price gave a small nod. And the body? A decoy, she said softly. I sewed my locket into the gown of a woman who had died the week before, drowned, unclaimed. I bribed the mortician. I needed time. The guests had fallen into murmured confusion now. Madame Vassel stood at the doorway, her face unreadable. You let us believe you were dead, Marius said darkly. Vivienne smiled. I needed to see who would mourn, and who would try to run. Price stepped between them now, voice firm. You are under arrest for espionage, falsifying identity, and the attempted murder of Lady Penrose. But Marius didn't move. He reached into his jacket slowly, and for a moment, Price tensed, ready for a weapon. But the man merely withdrew a white chess pawn, small and symbolic. A game well played, he said, placing it gently on the table beside him. But every piece falls eventually. He turned calmly to the constables stationed at the door. Shall we? They took him without struggle. Later that evening, the villa had emptied, the masks discarded like the lies they once held. On the balcony, Inspector Price and Lady Penrose stood side by side beneath the stars. You took a great risk, he said, letting the world believe you were dead. Vivienne looked out over the sea, her expression unreadable. I spent most of my life pretending to be someone else. A wife, a muse, a harmless socialite. This time, I was myself. And what will you do now? She looked at him with a faint, tired smile. Start over, with no mask, perhaps for the first time. Price nodded. Then let the curtain fall, and the truth take its bow. They stood in silence as the wind moved through the cypresses, and the villa behind them returned to stillness. The mystery had ended, but the sea, ever watchful, would remember.